If we had a Charlemagne event today, you and I would not be talking. In fact, billions of people would. Uh, and I'm not a prepper. I'm not, someone that even likes talking about this, but this is the reality. If we had a Charlemagne event today, much less a Carrington event, billions of people would die literally. Sometimes people say, who cares about ancient past, ancient civilization? And my answer is, yeah, it's interesting in its own right, but there's a lot to learn from it. And we need to understand what can happen, what will happen. Speak as a geologist. The sun is going to explode again. It may happen relatively soon.
First off, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure. Absolutely my pleasure. Thank you.
Very, very happy to be chatting with you. I've been following your work for a long time. We will get around to everything for people who are not familiar with your work, but we were sort of discussing a little bit there on solar radiation, and I imagine we'll route back round to it. But we were talking about self-driving cars and GPS kind of blowing up, and you got into the solar, solar radiation, solar flares, I suppose, more recently than your work that you're sort of primarily known for. Is that right?
Actually, well, when I say recent to me, now I've been working on ancient civilizations, pushing back the boundaries, should we say, temporal boundaries of how far civilization goes back. That really began with my work on the Great Sphinx. And I hate to date myself, but I first went to Egypt in 1990. So what's that, 36 years ago, almost to the day. Because it was the summer of 1990 with the late John Anthony West, because he had the question about whether the Sphinx really is 2500 BCE, or could its origins go back to a much earlier period. We can talk about that in great detail if you like, or as much detail as you do or don't want to talk about.
Or we could just talk about rubber ducks the whole time.
Exactly.
I do actually want to know, because I've heard the story of you and John Anthony West, and you sort of going out there and him sort of asking people to, I guess, prove him wrong in the first place. But what I want to know is a little bit more about you kind of before then. Like, what were you personally working on, and why did you decide to go and follow him in the first place? Why didn't you just go, this is absolutely ridiculous? Because that's what everyone thinks. Well, it's what a lot of people think about your work. I know a lot of people now give it credence, but you still have this mainstream sect, I suppose, center. So why did you do that in the first place? Why didn't you just kind of move on with whatever you were working on?
First place, and then we'll circle back around to solar activity and whatnot.
Yeah. We've got a lot to talk about.
Yeah, so there's a lot of complicated threads here. So I'll try to simplify some of it. I was always interested in ancient civilizations as far back as I can remember, literally as far back as I can remember, because I remember when I was, I don't know how old I was. I think I was maybe 4 years old or so, because I looked it up once. And tried to figure out how old I was. I remember going with my parents, because I was born in Washington, D.C., and lived in that area my entire pre-adulthood life, put it that way, because I even went to college at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., so it wasn't until I went to graduate school at Yale that I left the area. So getting back to my interest, I remember, and I think the exhibition was 1961, so I was 4 years old at the time. I remember going to an exhibition with my parents, a special exhibition of Tutankhamun treasures, not the gold mask, that type of thing, but I remember to this day this like golden glove I saw from ancient Egypt, and I was just fascinated by this type of thing. So I always kept that in the back of my mind. I read a lot about ancient history as a youngster growing up. I don't joke about this. I did very well in, public school, should we say, high school, that type of thing. But I actually sort of snuck out sometimes and go to the library down the street and read, this sounds very nerdy, Plato and that type of thing. And I never got in trouble because, I wasn't causing fights or anything. I was just,
Great. Yeah, I don't think I've ever heard of anyone sneaking out of school to go and read books in a library.
Yeah, exactly. We're worried about the knife fights and whatnot. And then to make another long story short, another thread, my grandmother, who I was, many people are very influenced by their grandparents versus their parents. Of course, they both have an influence. I only knew one grandmother, one grandparent, because the rest, that's another story, and was World War II and that type of thing. And I'm from German Dutch ancestry, and they came over, during and after the war.
Sure.
But my one grandmother, she was, and lots of academics hold this against me, I admit that, she was a theosophist. So she was very interested in ancient history through theosophy, and not necessarily, quote, straight, conventional, dogmatic ancient history, but also alternative views to ancient history. She was very open to the concept that ancient cultures were much more sophisticated than they've been given credit for, going much further back. So she was open to that. But I also want to say she was a really intelligent woman. And I think that's just the honest truth, not
Yeah.
just my opinion as a kid. Very well read. And she also instilled in me not only the love and interest and encouraged it, but she also instilled in me to be very, very critical, very skeptical. Don't, she'd give me things and say, oh, yeah, read it, but don't believe it just because it's written in a book.
Mm.
And so she, I think I got off to a good intellectual start with that.
What
And
sort of, can I ask what the sort of other like central tenets? Because I've tried to understand theosophy, and everywhere I go, it's sort of explained slightly differently. So I'm wondering if you could explain what the main. I know it's not a specific religion. People say, oh, you think it's a cult or something, and it's like, no,
no,
there's no
no,
person to pay, there's no priest, there's nothing to necessarily
no,
adhere to. So I'm
no,
trying to understand like what the sort of
no.
definition of it is.
Okay, and I'm not a theosophist. I want to be
Sure.
clear. I'm not a
From
theosophist.
what you understand,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, she was a theosophist in the Netherlands,
Mm.
before she came to America as an adult. And her view of theosophy was that theosophy involved looking into the nature of humans, the ancient roots of humanity, the relationship of humans to the cosmos, to any what's called divine beings or spiritual entities. Uh, some of the big names in theosophy are Blavatsky and Besant, Ledbetter, etc. And but it really was a search, I would say, for the philosophical, spiritual roots of humanity, and a lot of emphasis because the Theosophy Society, many people know, they moved to India. Uh, they drew from the ancient traditions of India to try to understand, I would say, ultimately, the place of humanity in the bigger picture,
Mm.
both temporally and spiritually, geographically, et cetera, et cetera. So I always saw it as very much a search. That is the way it was instilled to me. Uh, and no, it's absolutely not a religion. At least that's my view, what I understood to be the case, but was much more open, should we say, especially in the 19th century when it originated, compared to, say, dogmatic Christianity or dogmatic anything. Uh, Much of it was really, to me, anti dogmatism, looking at other options, looking at other possibilities. Uh, and a reaction, I would say, and this is again my own view from being immersed in it through my grandmother as a child, um, that it was something beyond, the sort of the overwhelming paradigm of the day, which tended to be very, in Western societies, very strictly Christian, etc. Don't be afraid to look at other religions. Are there
Mm.
truths in other religions? Is there something to be, gained from other philosophical tenets, other philosophical systems, be it India or South America or the
Yeah. I
far.
don't know. I don't know if it was specifically theosophy, but are you familiar with Alan Watts?
Give me a clue. Alan Watts. Yes, the name is ringing a bell. I'm trying to
He's
play.
sort of a English gentleman who came to America in sort of the 50s, and he was explaining a lot of Eastern religious ideas
Yes,
to
yes, yes.
Westerners and combined it with philosophy and
Exactly.
biology. And you can go and listen to his
Yeah,
lectures. He's got hundreds of hours of just sort
yeah.
of
I
talking
know.
online, and it sounds similar. I don't know if it's the
Yeah,
exact
I
same,
know who
but
you're talking about now. I'm from. I had to let it ring a bell for a second. Yeah, I would say that's very similar in that way. And of course, there are lots of different branches and different opinions within
sure.
any kind of. I don't know if I'd call it a movement, that type of thing. The other thing about theosophy, and this gets very questionable, and there may have been some fraud involved, etc. And this is something I'm very seriously interested in. This is another line of research for me, or interest, should we say, is I'll use the term parapsychology, but
Yes.
psychic phenomena. So some of the theosophists and actually talked about, psychic experiences, and they even, you know, I hate to say it, some of them were exposed as fraudulent. It got to the point, and that sort of stained the whole movement, if you would, when you've got
Yeah.
some leaders who are then producing quote letters from the what did they call them? Sort of spiritual leaders in India or whatnot. I forget the name they used for them now, but they were sort of like these guru types that were not really deceased, but they were, you know, from a very long time ago, but somehow still communicating, that type of
Mm.
thing.
Mm.
So it really was sort of, that there, in any movement, probably you have problems, you have issues, you have individuals.
You're always going to get con men,
Yeah,
and
con men, con women, et cetera,
yeah.
et cetera. And then there were some questions as to whether some of the leaders had made up some of the stories about going to, exotic places and monasteries and that type of thing. And again,
Mm.
that getting back to my grandmother, and then we'll get back to John Anthony West. My grandmother, she realized that she was very skeptical about some of it. It's sort of like you take the good and you filter out the bad, you filter out the nonsense, et cetera, et cetera. And I wanted to say that I'm absolutely, this is another subject for another day, and maybe I shouldn't say this, but I've written about it. Um, uh, certain types of experiences, parapsychological experiences, telepathy, etc., they actually do occur. And I mean, I think you can demonstrate that. But the problem is when you go, these people read crystal balls and all that nonsense, there's so much nonsense involved. Um, and, 90 plus percent is nonsense. And, then that gives a whole thing a bad name. And
Yeah,
then
of course. There's
everything is,
grafters and con men. I know you're very
uh,
familiar with Project Stargate and the Stanford
yeah,
Research Institute and remote
yeah,
viewing and all that, and it's fascinating. And I've spoken to people who were a part of that project, and it's fascinating. And I do think there's something to it.
yeah, yeah.
Um, I'm
I,
curious to hear. Like, I kind of want to get into. Sorry, I do want to track a little bit back to Egypt because I sort of want to follow your journey through that and then how you came to the parapsychology. I'm
yeah,
fascinated about that specific journey as well.
yeah. Okay. Well, there's a lot of things here.
There's
So
a lot
anyway,
of things. We'll be here for hours.
yeah, yeah. So getting
Mm,
back to what we were just talking about,
mm,
and I don't know if I explained it very well, but I was giving my personal view of theosophy and my relationship to it, should we say, through my grandmother when I was a child. And again, I want to be very clear, I'm not endorsing or dismissing anything specific right now, and I'm not a theosophist in that sense. But, I have a lot of respect for the Theosophy Society to this day. So, getting back to John Anthony West, he approached me in the late 1980s. So, I was very interested in ancient civilizations just inherently. When I went to, I also love art and
mm,
ancient art in particular. So, when I went to college, George Washington University, I think about 1975, I was going to be an art historian major, art history major. Uh, that lasted less than a semester because, no, this sounds really mean almost, or egotistical. I was all excited about taking the first course in the major, the upper level, whatever, the best course I could take. I knew it all because I'd spent so much time reading and, back then George in Washington, D.C., going to the museums, which were free for me, and we didn't have air conditioning at home, and summers in Washington, D.C. are pretty hot and muggy, so what do? Go to the air-conditioned museums. And I learned a lot, and it was an easy A, as they say, but it was not challenging. I had to take other courses for distributional requirements. I took a geology course. I found it absolutely fascinating. So after the first semester, all of a sudden I was a geology major and also anthropology slash archaeology major. I actually got 2 undergraduate degrees in 4 years. So I decided to pursue my interest through anthropology slash archaeology and geology. And I never gave up the interest that I started with. I just went down a slightly different path in terms of what majors I would have, etc. So let's go 4 years further. I'm graduating from George Washington University. I've got now a bachelor's degree in geology. I've got another bachelor's degree in anthropology with, focus on archaeology. I have no clue what I want to do. I don't want to work for an oil company, just out of principle, I guess.
Sure. Yeah.
So I didn't know what to do really, and I'm talking to a friend of mine, and her boyfriend had gone to Yale, and he said, "Oh, why don't you just go to Yale?" So I applied to Yale, and the Geology and Geophysics department was accepted. Spent 4 years there, got my Ph.D. and a couple of masters, but main thing is the Ph.D. in geology and geophysics. Then what do? I don't know what to do. So they gave me a job at the Peabody Museum of Natural History at Yale for a year while I could figure out what I want to do. And I applied to different academic positions. I ended up at Boston University, began there in 1984. So I'm a geologist at Boston University, geologist and geophysicist, and I get to know a fellow who is an English professor. Now, this English professor had in the past taught English in Cairo at I think it was American University in Cairo, and he had run across this funny guy named John Anthony West, an independent Egyptologist, as he said, and he thought that West was actually pretty smart and pretty compelling in his statements that, the Sphinx is not weathered the same way it is as all the other pyramids and whatnot. It looks weird, it looks older, it looks like it goes back to an earlier period, because everyone knew that the Sahara Desert's been a desert for at least the last 5,000 years, and it sure looked to West's eye and to geologists he spoke to, but then they didn't want to be on the record, that the Sphinx itself looks like it's weathered by water. Erosion from water. West wasn't sure where this water was coming from, etc., but he thought this should put it back to an earlier period. And he was talking to this English professor and he made the offhand comment to the English professor who asked West, they both related it to me decades ago. The English professor said, "Well, if I can ever help you in any way, promote your theory or get it looked into, just let me know." And West apparently responded by saying, "If you ever find an open-minded geologist to actually look at it, let me know." So next thing you know, 84, 85, we are both at Boston University. That is the English professor and myself. We get to know each other, and then he tells John Anthony West, "Oh, there is this geologist who I've gotten to know at Boston University, a fellow faculty member," and he fed me, the English professor, very carefully and slowly sort of information about John Anthony West, initially not even mentioning his name. It was very funny, actually, and some pictures of the Sphinx. And, I'd never been to Egypt, and started looking at them. And then this culminated the initial phase with John Anthony West being invited by the university, um, specifically the college I was in, to give a public lecture on his work. And that would include his radical ideas about the age of the Sphinx. Now, it turns out this public lecture was given really for an audience of one, myself, although, the auditorium was filled. I mean, lots
Yeah.
of people came to it, but the reason I found out later, was to let me be there and see it.
Sounds like you were being co-opted by the KGB or something. Is it the much more healthy version of that?
It does. No, it was because I guess he'd had the experience before of just being rejected immediately by anyone with credentials. So where was I? So he comes and he speaks, but I'd already been prepped a little bit. But that point, I did know his name. There was no way I was not going to go to this lecture because my interest was, piqued. I thought this was sort of interesting. And why did I go? You asked that before. Because actually, when you look at the photographs that he showed me, when I looked at the photographs in the slideshow, etc., it did look a little weird from a geologic point of view. So there was something possibly going on there, I thought in my head. On the other hand, I could not readily believe that if there was something going on there, that it actually meant the Sphinx was older. I thought that there must be something else going on there that, okay, so you've got somewhat anomalous weathering and erosion on the Sphinx, but there must be some special circumstances, et cetera, et cetera. I also want to mention, to give credit where credit's due, this was not original to John Anthony West. He got the idea that the Sphinx is older from Schwaller de Lubitsch, who was a philosopher, Egyptologist, etc. I believe he died in 1961, so I never met him. But he had said, Schwaller said, in sort of an offhand line in one of his books, that the Sphinx itself is heavily weathered and eroded, apparently by water, which would suggest that it goes back to a much earlier period. And actually, when I started doing the research on it, the library research, it turns out a lot of Egyptologists in the 19th century commented on the Sphinx, and that maybe the Sphinx was older than the pyramids. So this was actually a view that was being circulated, and it wasn't until the 20th century with people like Salim Hassan, who was a great early 20th century Egyptologist, who started, basically initiate the dogma, and I use that term in a technical sense, the dogma among Egyptologists, at least at the time, and I hope that's changing now, that the Sphinx is 2500, circa 2500 BCE, that is fourth dynasty, under the Pharaoh Khafra, that was carved under the Pharaoh Khafra, or also known as Chevron. So that dogma, if you would, and I don't use that in a disparaging way, just as a simple term, that concept really goes back to the early mid-20th century in its current form. So it doesn't even go back to the earliest Egyptologists. So there were some weird things going on, but I was very, very careful to say I could not judge based on a slideshow, based on the best photographs that he could show me, because geology is geology. You don't, at least for me, and I've learned this through many years of field experience, even before I met John Anthony West, you have to see the rocks, you have to see the context, you have to know what's going on. A classic example of that is Yonaguni, which I don't know that we want to get into that, but people think it's artificial. It's not artificial. It's a natural phenomenon that's off the coast of Japan, and it's not a underwater pyramid. Although
Yeah,
it's
it looks very strange. That's I couldn't.
what?
Sorry, I couldn't remember which one Yanaguni was, but yeah, I remember
Yeah,
off the
it's off
coast
the
of
coast of
Japan, and I know
little
Graham
island.
Hancock's talked about it a little bit, but it seems to be a natural
Yeah,
formation
it's
as
a natural
opposed to
formation,
yeah,
and that it's a very interesting natural formation. So
yeah.
I thought that's a later example, but I only bring it up as something we could talk about on the other side. Actually, it's important for me as a scientist that no, I don't just jump on any old thing that might support my work, my proposals, my hypothesis, my theories, whatever you want to call it. In fact, I've had people say, "Oh, why don't you accept X, Y, or Z, Yanaguni, etc.? It would support your theory." I say, "No, of course I'm not going to support it if the evidence isn't there. I'm going to call it the way it is." So I told John Anthony West that there's no way I was going to express an opinion ultimately on the Sphinx or what the erosion meant, etc., if I couldn't see it in person. I thought that was the end of the story. I really did. So this is the late 1980s, but we kept in contact, etc., etc. And then he arranged, I didn't get paid, but he gave me the airline ticket and the hotel. If I wanted to, he offered to bring me to Egypt so I could see it for myself in person. He basically took me up on, some people would say, called my bluff, that I had to see it in person. And so I went to Egypt with him. Before I went to Egypt, we actually attended some Egyptological conferences, so I got a sense of Egyptologists and what they're like and sort of their mindset, if you would, which was very interesting. And I found it fascinating because, again, since I was 4 years old, I was interested in such things. So we end up going to Egypt in the summer of 1990. That was my first trip to Egypt. I've been there more times than I can remember now, but that was my first trip. I saw the Sphinx in person. I want to say, even on the airplane, flying to Egypt with John Anthony West, and he's deceased now for people that don't know that. So he's unfortunately passed away. We became very, very close friends over the years. He's a generation, or was a generation older than me, essentially the same age as my father, who's also deceased. But we were flying to Egypt, and at that time, I don't know him well at all. Although we always had good, sort of personalities sort of clicked or something. But I didn't know him that well. And I'm thinking to my head, even as we're landing, I am ripping this guy off. This is horrible. He's paying for me to fly to Egypt. And I'm just going to find within an hour or two what the solution is geologically and why the Sphinx is simply 2500 BCE and he's mistaken because he's been misled and doesn't know geology. And I warned him that that could well be the case, and he took it in stride and said he wanted to know the real answer. So we go to Egypt. Well, we land in Egypt, in Cairo. We go to the Giza Plateau. I don't remember if it was probably the next day. And there I am with the Sphinx. And I had been warned by some people, oh, it's such a powerful spiritual experience. You might, who knows what, go into some kind of state of
Sort of
altered
trance
being.
or yeah.
What? Yeah, I mean, literally, people said that. And I tried to be very scientific, very objective about it. And I look at the Sphinx, and there's two things I see, and I'm not exaggerating here, within, I usually say 120 seconds or so. One, the Sphinx, how should I say this? It's really impressive, but I noticed immediately the head is too small for the body. And the head is weathered very differently than the body. And secondly, the body compared to everything else sure does show different erosional features. Very straightforward, in my opinion, precipitation induced, that is, rain falling down on the body of the Sphinx, and more importantly, the walls of the Sphinx enclosure. Because to carve the body of the Sphinx, they had to cut down into the bedrock. So it literally sits in what looks like a pit or quarry. In fact, people say it's a quarry, which it was, for other structures, and they carved the body of the Sphinx. So you literally, most tourists, when they go see the Sphinx, they stand up on what's known as the causeway, and they look down at the Sphinx. You sort of look at the head directly, eyesight, but you have to look down to see the body. And most importantly, I saw what I describe as a rounded, rolling, undulating profile, which you do not get in desert conditions from sandblasting, from wind, that type of thing. And really significant is that there are vertical fissures in that rounded, rolling, undulating profile where the water would cut down vertically as it flowed down the sides of the walls, sides of the Sphinx body itself, but not so much on the body because the body doesn't have that large a catchment area versus the enclosure does. And when you look at that plateau, water in very, very ancient times, so well before dynastic times, would flow down towards the Sphinx, which is on the eastern edge of the plateau, and the general paleohydrology of the plateau at that time is that all this water would flow and flow into the enclosure, and so you get very well developed precipitation features and basically water runoff features, and that's not going to happen in the last 5,000 plus years. Now, something that a lot of my critics will say immediately is, oh, it's from rising floods from the Nile, because yeah, the Nile does flood periodically, and even historical times it's been recorded that you can get water rising so high that it starts to, flood the Sphinx enclosure just a little bit. I looked at that very carefully, two things very quickly, and there's a lot more geology I could go into technically. You would get incredible undercutting of the rock. So if you think of the wall, you would get undercutting, which, yeah, you get a little bit because the softest layers are actually on the bottom of the Sphinx enclosure wall, but you would get a lot more undercutting than you do if it was just from rising water from below, more or less Nile flooding. Secondly, you would not get those vertical fissures that I'm talking about. That's from water from above. So, really quickly, I realized there is something amiss here. There is some problems with the standard dating, and it probably goes back to an earlier climatic period. And that's all I could say at that time, which, to be blunt, I did not even say that on the record. I basically told Wes that, yeah, there is something interesting here geologically. We need to research this further. So we made numerous trips back. We did seismic work. So Thomas DeBecke, a geophysicist, fellow geophysicist at the time, he's now retired. We did what's known as low-level seismic studies around the Sphinx right in the enclosure because I wanted to see what is going on in the subsurface. And what we found, which I actually was expecting, is that you have much deeper subsurface weathering, basically mineralogical changes that occur once the floor of the Sphinx is exposed, more or less exposed when they carved out the body of the Sphinx. And we could calibrate that. We could compare it to known tombs from 23 to 2600 BCE, which had much less subsurface weathering around them, mineralogical changes around them. We could calibrate that. My initial calibration, which was incorrect, I will say that bluntly now, was that the Sphinx had to be at least 5 to 7,000 BCE. Why was it incorrect? As I took more data into account, what I had done in 5 to 7,000 BC, which is what I initially published, was ludicrous from an Egyptological point of view,
Yeah.
but my fellow geologists pointed out that I had done basically calibration where I assumed that the subsurface weathering was consistent. It kept weathering at the same rate, going down, 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 down. But what would really happen, because you're not removing the overburden, as you go down deeper, it slows down. So if you take that into account, it puts it more in the 10,000 BCE range, which is even crazier from Egyptological point of view. But I am now convinced, based on reanalysis of it, more or less, it's not linear. Uh, Depth of weathering, it drops off as it goes down further. I'm more and more, not only more and more convinced, I'm absolutely convinced at this point that it goes back to about 10,000 or so BCE, the origins of the Sphinx, taking that into account. And then when we start supplementing it with other evidence that we have sophisticated culture, sophisticated civilization at that time, like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, it all starts to tie together. And then on top of that, we have evidence, and this is something I studied as a graduate student, the end of the last ice age, which was absolutely catastrophic at 9700 BCE. That's a very accurate date that we have from ice cores and sediment cores, etc. That something cataclysmic happened, and that's what wiped out, demolished essentially, or set back, however you want to say it, this early round, what I call early cycle of civilization. So it all starts to fit together into a unified picture, and then bringing in one more thread. As of 2010 or so, Katie, my wife, Catherine Ulysses, she and I went to Easter Island in 2010. I had spoken at a conference in, where was it, Dubai, that I was invited to, organized by, at that time, the Chilean ambassador to, I guess he was a Chilean ambassador for the the UAE, United Arab Emirates. But who owns, quote, owns Easter Island? It's Chile. And so he had never been there before. We got along well with he and his wife and my wife, Katie, and myself. And, we basically made a friendship. And then out of the blue, a little later, he says, well, I'm going to Chile. I'm sorry, I'm going to Easter Island because it's the one part of Chile I've never been to, but you'd like to come with us. So we joined him for that as a little, I don't know, research/vacation trip, very
Sure.
quickly. And we were,
Business and pleasure.
yeah, it was wonderful. And we were married on Easter Island. But how does this tie in? Easter Island has something known as in English they say Rongo Rongo. It's not really pronounced that way. In Rapa Nui, it's pronounced a way that most people, if you haven't been brought up with the language, it's more like Rogo Rogo. But we say Rongo Rongo. It's a script. It's a mysterious script. And something that Katie knows is that it ties in with plasma configurations you would see in the sky as developed by Los Alamos physicist Dr. Anthony Perrott, when you would have a major solar outburst. And then things started all fitting together. I'm summarizing a lot that's going on here. Bottom line is, why did we have that cataclysmic disruption at the end of the last ice age? Why did we have all of a sudden temperatures just going wild, going up, everything melting? You have incredible rainfall because you're putting all this moisture into the atmosphere. It comes down as precipitation. It ties in with the Sphinx. Having this incredible evidence of precipitation from the sky. Solar outburst. There was a major solar outburst at that time, and we are now learning since 2010, frankly, when Katie and I started talking about this. She made the initial observation and got me thinking about the sun, and I had met Dr. Anthony Perrott, years ago, I think I had a conference back in 2000, and I sort of knew about his work, but it didn't seem real relevant to me because he was talking about some kind of major solar outburst in antiquity, but I didn't really know what the time frame was. But it all came together that yes, this would be a mechanism that could cause the end of the last ice age, would give all the geological features I've been looking at. And basically wipe out an early, as I call it, early cycle of civilization. So things start all coming together by the early 2010, 2012. I first published this, uh, really putting it all together in a book called Forgotten Civilization, The Role of Solar Outbursts in Our Past and Future, the first edition, 2012. It's now in a second revised, expanded edition with a different subtitle. Uh, what we called the period since the demise of this early civilization, what Katie and I came up with it, because we had to have a name for it, was the solar-induced dark age. So basically humanity went into a, quote, solar-induced dark age from about 9700 BCE to the rise or reinvigoration, the rebooting, to use a computer terminology, of civilization in the fourth millennium BCE. So about 6,000 years. Let's say round numbers 9,700 BCE to 3,700 BCE. That fourth millennium, 37, 36, 3,100 BCE. What do you have on Earth? You have the rise, quote, rise of civilization in places like Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, maybe a little bit later. No, it's not the rise of civilization. I think of it now as the reemergence of civilization. And they themselves, in their traditions, would talk about how there had been an earlier civilization. This was passed on, but it's never been taken seriously until recently, I think, by most academic scholars. The classic example, I'm putting out a lot of threads right now, and we can talk about any of them in detail.
I'm trying to hold on to as many as I can.
Yeah, the classic example is Atlantis. Plato
Yeah.
talking about Atlantis. And Plato, when you look at Plato literally and not say, oh, he got things wrong and he made it up, etc., he says that Atlantis was destroyed 9,000 years before Solon. He describes the destruction of Atlantis. Okay, Solon was this Athenian before his time. Most people most people date Solon to about 600 BCE. So now 9,000 years is 9,600 BCE. What did I just say? The best dating for the end of the last ice age is 9,700 BCE. Plato was talking in round terms, broad terms. I think he got the date almost exactly right.
Yeah.
And we have
Are you familiar with Michael Donnellan's work on Atlantis? Atlantica, I think he calls the series.
It sounds familiar, and I mean, there's been so much on Atlantis. There's literally been thousands of books and whatnot.
There's a man who's discovered what we think is Atlantis. He was on the podcast. He was on my podcast a couple of months ago. It's in Spain. It's in Cadiz.
Oh yeah, I know who you're talking about. I don't want to comment on that because
Please comment on that. What do you? I don't know if you've seen his series or if you.
Yeah, I am familiar with, but I think I may have even heard him speak at one conference or something. I believe we did. Katie says we did. Katie's my wife in the background.
Taking notes.
I find, no, this is what I want to say, and I'm not saying anything positive or negative about him or any other people who are searching for the location of Atlantis. What I want to say is I find everything interesting, but that is not my primary interest right now.
Of course.
My primary interest is the dating of what was a cycle of civilization that Plato apparently does more than allude to. Now, could he have, traditions are passed down and all the things were not exactly correct, certainly maybe not as to what materials they were using and who knows what. But to me, the temporal positioning, not the geographic positioning, is what's important for my research at the moment.
Mm. Mm.
So to me, it doesn't matter whether Atlantis is in Spain or in the middle of the Atlantic or in India or, I gotta say, I've read so many different books and articles
Yeah.
going back to at least the early 19th century about the placement of Atlantis. But so I'm not judging that. And he could be right, he could be wrong,
No.
or could there be more than one Atlantis geographically? Because this was potentially a widespread culture or
Yeah.
civilization at that time.
Well,
Uh,
it's the Younger Dryas impact you've been talking about, right? That
okay,
supposedly, or is that slightly different from the solar flare?
oh, let me be very clear about that then.
Yeah.
Younger Dryas impact, I don't believe there's good evidence for a Younger Dryas impact.
Okay.
I
Mm.
don't at all. I don't accept a Younger Dryas impact. And a Younger Dryas impact is at 10,900 BCE by the impact people. Those who support it, 10,900, or some of them will date to 10,800. What we do know is that, yes, we have the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas is a period of time, and I will just use the numbers 10,900 BC to 9,700 BC. So it's a 1,200-year period of time where the Ice Age, things were slowly getting warmer. The Ice Age was coming to an end. Then you have this event, and all of a sudden things get really cold again for 1,200 years. And then at 9,700 BCE, they warm up like crazy again.
Mm.
Okay, so that is real. I mean, in a sense, we have evidence for it. And we
Yeah.
have evidence at both the beginning and the ending of the Younger Dryas that something catastrophic was happening. And we have things like wildfires and nanodiamonds and spirals and vitrification, that
Yeah.
type of thing. And in many cases, this type of data has been used by my fellow geologists and archaeologists to indicate a comet or asteroid or something like that, because you will get that type of evidence from a cometary impact or a major meteorite or asteroid. I'm not going to get into trying to distinguish them because this is a whole another business in
I've
astrophysics.
learnt about it before, and I can't possibly remember the
Yeah,
definitions. I know they're all slightly different from each other, and yeah,
yeah,
but yeah,
exactly. And actually, now they're graying into each other because some of the concepts of comets were not well founded as to what makes up a comet. So I'm not getting into that right now. That would be another
it's fine.
conversation.
We've got enough other threads to sort of loop back to.
Okay, but what I want to point out right now is
Yeah.
that the evidence, yes, there is evidence for something, very good evidence for something happening at 10,900 BCE and also 9,700 BCE. But usually, and up until I would say very recently, and I'm not the only one saying this, these types of markers have been used to indicate there was some kind of physical impactor. The same evidence can indicate major plasma discharges. Plasma is electrically charged particles at very high speeds, a good percentage of the speed of light in some cases, etc., impacting Earth. Think of huge thunderbolts hitting Earth. They can actually cause cratering. In fact, a lot of impactors, what causes cratering is the shock wave of it, not the actual impact of it. You have the same thing with plasma discharges from a solar outburst. So from a solar outburst, and you have evidence, say, petroglyphs showing weird things that people were seeing in the sky, which are not comets, but they would be plasma configurations. Some of them look like stick figure men, etc., during a solar outburst. So the evidence that's being used for the impact at the beginning of the Younger Dryas, I think, is better explained by a solar outburst. So that's where I'm coming from. And why would a solar outburst cause it to cool and then another solar outburst. See, I think that the Younger Dryas was bound by solar outbursts. The first one caused a cooling effect, and the second one a major warming effect. And that seems counterintuitive unless you understand the positioning of things on Earth at those two times. What do we have at 10,900 BCE? We have, as I said, glaciers were slowly melting because we had slow warming. You had huge, huge lakes on the glaciers. I'm simplifying here, but huge lakes on the glaciers, especially in North America, of fresh, cold water. Fresh water basically doesn't matter if it's cold or not really. And they were bound by ice dams.
Right.
You have a solar outburst, and there's evidence, very good evidence published independently, that these ice dams broke catastrophically around 10,900 BCE. Why did they break catastrophically? I believe because of the warming from a solar outburst. It sent all this water into the ocean, especially the North Atlantic, which is where you really have the evidence for the cooling of the Younger Dryas. It's mostly a northern hemisphere phenomenon. It changed circulation patterns. It changed everything and sent the Earth into this cold spell, short-term 1,200-year cold spell, which we call the Younger Dryas. But the sun was being very active at that time. There was another major solar outburst at the end of the Younger Dryas. It ended the Younger Dryas 9,700 BCE, and at that point, conditions have changed. These glacial lakes have, emptied, etc. And that final one in 9,700 BCE is what threw us into the warming period and threw us into what we now have, post-glacial, at least post-last glacial period. So to me, when you start looking at everything, what seems counterintuitive is not at all. The sun can do different things or have different effects logically, depending on what the conditions are on Earth at that time. So again, I'm not belittling the impact.
I didn't think you were. I didn't think you were. And it doesn't actually make that much of a difference at the end of the day, whether it was the Younger Dryas impact or whether it was a solar flare. But the point of that was Michael Donnellan has put out this series called Atlantica, where he thinks he's found Atlantis because it lines up with a lot of the specifications of Plato's texts. And he's gone out and he's mapped the ocean, and there is something there that is clearly a structure. So at the very least, what I would say is I'd be fascinated to know if you ever connected with him to talk about, because you're really both talking about sort of like structures that seem to go back further than anyone really has any explanation for. And the more of these we find, Göbekli Tepe, and from what I understand as well, now there's all these other sites around Göbekli Tepe. There's just more and more and more of these things that they're finding. I don't actually know how many they've found that are supposedly in Turkey.
A couple dozen now that have been identified. The second most famous one right now is Karhan Tepe. But they all go back. They show, I think, very good evidence, excuse me, that we have this cycle, as I call it, of civilization back at the end of the last ice age. I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice. Excuse me.
That's okay. Do you need some water or anything?
Civilization at the end of the last ice age. And interestingly, the conditions in Turkey and Egypt, etc., were very different, because this was basically during the Younger Dryas that this cycle of civilization was proliferating and developing, et cetera, and probably for a couple thousand years. I mean, it goes back much further. We don't know how far back it goes. We know it was ended in 9,700 BCE. And during that Younger Dryas conditions, it was much more moderate in places that are now desert. There was much more rainfall. It was a much more habitable area. And could, the same with underwater structures, because at the end of the last ice age, 9,700 BCE, you had the final melting of the glaciers, you had the precipitation, et cetera, et cetera. Sea levels rose, so anything along coastal areas was flooded, which could tie in with, lands being flooded. When you look at Plato's account of what happened to Atlantis, recorded over 9,000 years later, it sure fits, in my opinion, what you would expect during a major solar outburst and the geological effects of that. Again, people interpret comet versus solar outburst. I think the evidence is toward the solar outburst. Um, and I'm and I also want to make one very quick point.
Mm.
10,900 BCE, that's the comet people dating.
Yeah.
I'm actually talking, my research is primarily 9,700 BCE, 1,200 years later at the end of the last ice age. They're not addressing that. So I've had many people say, oh, a comet ended the last ice age. And they're talking about an event that's 1,200 years earlier and actually started, if you would, a cold spell at the end of the last ice age, did the opposite to end it. It actually made it colder for another 1,200 years. One last point I want to make, because I think this is important for maybe your viewers and whatnot,
Sure.
is that we are now learning that the sun is very unstable. It's not the stability that it's had for the last 500 years, even a few thousand years. There was something known as the Carrington event in 1859, which was a very minor solar outburst, all things considered, very, very minor astrophysically. Uh, the Carrington event knocked out telegraph lines in 1859. It set telegraph stations on fire. People saw things in the sky that resemble the petroglyphs and the Rongo glyphs in the sky. They literally recorded seeing them. These plasma configurations is what I'll call them. And if we had a 1859 Carrington equivalent event today, it would wipe out our communication systems. It would wipe out our electrical grids. It would fry the electronics from what's known as a solar particle event or solar proton event, SPE. You'd have electromagnetic pulses with it, et cetera, et cetera. So this is really significant. Number one, that the sun is not as stable as everyone always thought it was. Back in 775, 776, somewhere around there, AD, or Common Era, there's what's known as the Charlemagne event. This has now been picked up with radioisotopes. A lot of this is based on dendrochronology and looking at isotopes in the trees and sediment cores and ice cores, etc. And this is just in the last 15, 16, 17 years, people have started really looking at this. We had the Charlemagne event, where people at the time, again, described seeing weird things in the sky, et cetera, et cetera. But, there was not the electrical grid technology that we have now. It was just a scary thing. People thought, oh, the world's going to end, but then it went away and the world did not end. If we had a Charlemagne event today, you and I would not be talking. In fact, we need billions of people would. And I'm not a prepper. I'm not, someone that even likes talking about this, but this is the reality. If we had a Charlemagne event today, much less a Carrington event, billions of people would die, literally. When you think about how dependent we are on modern technology and transportation and distribution systems, et cetera, plus on top of that, and I'm a bit of an environmentalist, I admit, we have all these nuclear power plants, and they would go down. They probably have Fukushima style or even Chernobyl style around the world, and 400 plus power plants. We'd have radiation. I mean, these are serious things. And my point right now is not to scare anyone, but sometimes people say, who cares about ancient past, ancient civilization? And my answer is, yeah, it's interesting in its own right, but there's a lot to learn from it. And we need to understand what can happen, what will happen. I speak as a geologist. The sun is going to explode again. It may happen relatively soon. People ask me how soon. Some people, astrophysicists, there was the late Thomas Gold, who was at Cornell University, who first started talking about this in the 1960s. Essentially, his fellow scientists said, look, you've done all this brilliant work, but this is too far out. The sun can't be that unstable. He thought it happened about every 10,000 years. He actually had evidence in 1969 from the lunar surface that the sun had undergone a major solar outburst. Why from the moon? He was involved with the early Apollo missions and the samples that were brought back and the data that was brought back, and he found evidence of this having occurred in what he called the recent past, the recent, geologically recent past, I think is the way he said it, which really means the end of the last ice age now when we can date it. And so these are important things. So just one last point, because I know I'm talking a lot and I apologize about this,
No.
but we know other stars, solar type stars and related stars, go through periods of what now the term is being called micronovas, that they can explode but not be destroyed. They can do this on a periodic basis. And I think that a working hypothesis is that our sun goes through these things of maybe a 13 to 15,000 year cycle where it's very volatile, very active for a couple of millennia. Think Younger Dryas when it's very active there. It then calms down, if you would, goes through a period of relative stability for 10, 12,000 years, then becomes active again. And we actually have astrophysical evidence that the sun is starting to go through an active period again, just like we saw at the end of the last ice age. So there's real implications, I think, for this type of data. I never thought that John Anthony West getting me involved with the Sphinx would lead me to talk about what we are talking about now.
I want to sort of circle back a little bit just to when you were talking about the plasma, sort of the men in the sky, because I think we didn't quite hit on that image for people who aren't familiar with that, is that all around the world you see these images carved into stone, and it almost looks like a little man doing a dance or something, and he's got two little dots on either side, and it's the same exact shape, and you can see it pretty much literally all around the world. I've seen your and Katie's examples talking about this in different talks, and they are found around the world. And the theory is that this was some massive solar, essentially sort of the craziest, scariest version of the Northern Lights you've ever seen in your entire life, seen all around the world by loads of different people, and they were charting out whatever they saw.
Yes, exactly. And where a lot of credit is due here is from Dr. Anthony Peratt, who is now retired. I have met him at conferences. I've spoken with him. Otherwise, we've corresponded. We've traded information. He's now retired, but he first really put together this evidence of the global plasma petroglyphs. And what it is plasma, as I was saying before, is electrically charged particles at high speed that come from the sun. We always have the solar wind, that type of thing, but when you have major solar outbursts, or much less what's known as a micronova, you would have all this thrown off by the sun. So think of it, a lot of it's protons and electrons. Protons and electrons that have electrical charge. They're moving very quickly. As you have electrically charged particle moving, it generates a magnetic field perpendicular to its path. So you have these complex plasma phenomena, electromagnetic phenomena occurring, and they can be very, very powerful, very destructive. You have these hitting the Earth, hitting the atmosphere, causing what we think of as northern and southern lights, but at high intensities during a major solar outburst. And Dr. Peratt modeled this in supercomputers. He did these experiments where they would shoot it at, targets, plasma, underground. It would cost them hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to do one experiment, and they'd all have to back off, miles and lead shielding and all this to simulate what occurs in nature. And he was able to get these patterns that these take on distinct shapes. The plasma takes on distinct shapes. It has what are known as Z pinches without going into great detail. And one of the things that you get are these what look like stick figure men. and the stick figure men have these weird dots on their sides, and you see this around the world. Well, real humans don't have dots on their sides or donuts. That's synchrotron radiation. Another thing you get is what look like big sets of eyes, and this is a motif you see around the world. You get what are known as cascading cylindrical shapes going down, and you get stick figure men that look like they have birds' heads. So you get a bird head on a human, the birdman motif, which later, like many things in ancient civilizations, and this is something I learned way back when I was still in my teens or earlier, motifs, symbols will then become elaborated. They will become, people take a cross or whatever and elaborate on and make it look beautiful. But a lot of these motifs, like the Birdman or Bird Woman, Bird People, go back, I'm convinced, to this event. This was so meaningful to them, what they were seeing in the sky. There's actually a medieval description of birds, what look like birds or bird humans coming down during one of the more minor solar outbursts in medieval times. Again, if it had happened today, we wouldn't be talking here, you and I. But back in medieval times, they're not using electronics. So Dr. Peratt actually discovered these, started mapping them around the globe in over 130 countries or so. I mean, it's just incredible. He also found that when they were drawing them, these different motifs, on petroglyphs, that he could see or try to reconstruct where were they looking in the sky. So, you're on a wall and there are a cave, and the cave is pointing out in a certain direction. He found that there was a commonality. They were all looking towards the same part of the sky around the world. That seems to be where the major plasma at that time, the major solar outburst was coming in. And we see the northern and southern lights normally at very high latitudes, very far north or very far south. When you have this incredible energy coming in, these major solar outbursts, what happens is that the lights, if you would, what we think of as northern and southern lights, spread around the globe. So you can see them at very low latitudes, even at the equator during a major one. So during a major solar outburst, you literally see these people, ancient people, literally saw them around the world, and they were recording what they saw. Again, there's no, in my opinion, other explanation for these similarities around the world, for these diagnostic shapes, and I want to stress diagnostic shapes that he was able to determine in the laboratory and computer simulations and then see in the field. He was amazed when he first discovered this. He was absolutely amazed. I remember in one talk I saw a recording of where he's talking about this. He was sort of shocked that, oh God, they spent, who knows how much money to figure this out. And then he wanders out into New Mexico, very close to where he was living and working, and there are ancient petroglyphs that recording the same thing. They just spent all this money to figure out, and was at that time top secret, because this tied in, his work tied in with the plasma that's given off by atomic bombs and nuclear weapons, that type of thing, because you get some of the same phenomenon when you're exploding little. When I say little compared to the sun, they're little, they're huge from our point of view, nuclear weapons on Earth. So this had very real practical implications. That's how he got involved with it in Los Alamos, as I understand it. So this is a major discovery. I think it changes things fundamentally in terms of how we should perceive ancient civilizations, the deep history of humanity, and what's happening now, where it's going, and what are some of these motifs that you find around the world, like the Birdman. What's going on, what you see in the Rongo Rongo. Again, I was first brought to this when Katie pointed out that the Rongo Rongo glyphs of Easter Island sure resemble the plasma petroglyphs and the configurations that Dr. Peratt was exploring. And we actually published this not knowing that, in fact, Dr. Peratt and his team had been looking at Rongo Rongo also. And they actually, a member of his team actually contacted us and said, um, I paraphrase here, that your wife is correct. And we've already discovered this, but we purposely never published it. But we have been using that to study the sun to get more insight into what can happen during major solar outbursts. So he confirmed that we were on absolutely the right track. And I think it's wonderful in science when different threads, different researchers, they come together, they come to comparable conclusions or corroborative evidence. That's what science should be all about. So I think we have that very much here. Um, I just want to say one other thing because I skipped over it, never came back to it.
Please.
Remember I said when I first went to Egypt in 1990, the head's too small on
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Sphinx?
Yeah.
It's a
Mm.
recarved head. It is not the original head. I want to be very clear. And
Mm.
so I am not denying a lot of the Egyptological stuff. I am adding to it. I am pushing things back further. Were there were there Egyptians in Egypt in 3000 BCE and 2000 BCE? Of course there were. But how much did they inherit from an earlier civilization? How much were they reusing and reinterpreting, including the Sphinx? And someone recarved that head on the Sphinx. It's too small for the body. We now have evidence, and this is something that was first discovered by another colleague of mine, Manu Safzadeh, Dr. Manu Safzadeh, and Robert Boval, who is also a good friend, who is famous for their Rhine correlation theory on the Giza Plateau, if people know about that.
What?
We
Sorry, remind me what the Rhine
The
correlation is.
Rhine correlation is that the belt stars of Orion match the three major pyramids on the Giza Plateau. Robert Bauval came up with this independent of my work on the Sphinx and with John Anthony West. The thing is, they match the belt stars of Orion, but if you take the Milky Way into account and the Nile as the equivalent of the Milky Way on Earth, they don't match in 2600 BCE or 2400 BCE. They match more around 10,000, 10,500 BCE, which is really interesting because that now, that is a date that I came to conclude that the origins of the Sphinx go back to. So are the pyramids markers of an earlier period, just like we would put up a plaque dedicating something, that goes back much further, or do the pyramids really go back to that period? That's another question we could talk about. But it's interesting that this independent work by Robert Bauval came to the same time period, should we say, for activity or memorializing things on the Giza Plateau as I've come to with the Sphinx. Robert Bauval and I actually wrote a book together that was published in 2017 called Origins of the Sphinx, and we talk about all of this and how all this evidence came together. The thing about his initial evidence, and to this day, it's based on looking at mapping stars and, going back in time and the positions of the stars change over time, et cetera, et cetera. Mine is physical evidence on the ground. So archaeoastronomy versus geology, or not versus, with geology are coming to the same conclusion. Getting back to the head of the Sphinx, it's recarved. I'm convinced that it was a female lion initially, a lioness, which was known as Mehit or Mehet, and she guarded a chamber under her. This is what the most ancient texts from like 3000, 3100 BCE say. A lot of the Egyptologists said, well, there's no mention of the Sphinx before, at best, the fourth dynasty. Well, yeah, there is, except that it wasn't a sphinx and it wasn't called the Sphinx. It was a lioness, and that lioness was guarding a quote archive or something under her? Well, when we did the seismic work back in the early 1990s, on top of everything else, we found a chamber under her left paw, which I believe is the chamber that she, the female lioness, was guarding literally under her, just as the texts from, say, 30,000 plus BCE talk about this ancient structure guarding a chamber. Now, one last thing there, because some of your viewers may be familiar with this, there was a psychic, Edgar Cayce, the Edgar Cayce American psychic. He had, in one of his trances or readings, as they call it, talked about how the halls, not the halls, the records of Atlantis, I guess it was, Hall of Records, would be found near or under the Sphinx. And I knew nothing about that in the early 1990s until we published, and we published in Geoarchaeology, a good scholarly journal. We published our findings, including the chamber under the left paw of the Sphinx. And then I get a call from his son, because he himself had passed away, Edgar Cayce, but one of his sons, who was alive at the time, that, oh, I discovered the Hall of Records of Atlantis that his father had predicted. And I remember to this day getting that call at Boston University, and I was very polite. Oh, that's very interesting. I didn't know anything about this. I hang up the phone and I realized, this is big trouble for me, because the last thing I needed was my already skeptical Egyptologist, the fellow academics who were Egyptologists and historians, saying that, oh, I was out there to prove some psychic correct. And I was just looking for halls of records, which was not the truth at all. I mean, I didn't even know anything about it. I mean, I couldn't help that we found a chamber under the left paw of the Sphinx, but it did not help me. You understand what I'm saying? Did not
You know,
help
I do.
me.
I do. It's
Certain
funny.
academic circles,
I
they started spreading the rumors that I was somehow Caseyite, going to prove Cayce was correct. It turns out that actually the Caseyite, and I'll name names here, was a guy named Mark Lehner, who has become a very prominent Egyptologist, but he started his interest in Egyptology to prove Cayce correct. That's not me, but that's...
I find it entertaining that you sort of wanted to distance yourself from that and then wrote a book on parapsychology and just sort of blew past anything you were sort of concerned about.
Exactly, but the parapsychology revolution you're referring to, why did I get into that? Because when you look at ancient texts, you look at ancient traditions, etc., they simply assume certain phenomena that we would now put under the modern umbrella of parapsychology and psychic phenomena. So I was very interested. I went into it very skeptically, thinking this is a bunch of nonsense also, although I admit that, I already had evidence personally that probably wasn't nonsense. And when you start looking at it objectively, etc., as I mentioned earlier today in our little discussion here, there's a lot of nonsense. There's a lot of bunk. It's just ridiculous. And
can I ask what was the personal thing that you experienced?
Yeah. Okay, I'll tell you that in a second. I'll give you one example in a second.
Sure.
But there's a lot of nonsense and a lot of bunk, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Probably well over 90%. That doesn't mean there isn't something real that can occur, that, say, telepathic information can be passed on, etc. Okay, so here's one example that I grew up with, and I observed it numerous times. When I was growing up, my mother was the oldest of 3 daughters, so I had 2 aunts. Those 2 aunts, they're all deceased now, turned out to be, when I say turned out to be, they were identical twins. 2 aunts who were identical twins. When I was young, let's say 8, 10 years old, that range, so certainly old enough to think about things consciously, etc. I was very curious. I was very interested in everything. So let's say 8 to 12 years old, that range. And I was very close to my cousins who were the children of one of those twins, and they lived close by to where I lived in the DC area. So I was often visiting with them and my aunt and her husband, etc. We were all very close. They were as close to me as were my own sibling. We were just all very close. But the other aunt lived in North Carolina and had children too, so those were cousins of mine, but I wasn't quite as close to them. I observed many times when my aunt, who I was with, her name was Robbie, and I called her Aunt Robbie or Aunt Robbie, she would say, "The phone's about to ring, something horrible has happened." And sure enough, within 10 seconds, the phone would ring. And this was old-fashioned dial phones and stuff like that. And she'd pick up, and her sister would be on the other end of the line. And one of my cousins in North Carolina had just fallen down the stairs or, and had an accident and that type of thing. I mean, this happened on a regular basis. She was picking up things telepathically from her identical sister. And it even worked in reverse. When I went down to North Carolina, we'd go down there sometimes, once on occasion, and it would work the other way too. But to me, everything I've learned and know about it makes a lot of sense. That especially identical twins will have this telepathic connection. And I've had many telepathic experiences myself with people that I'm close to, both receiving and sending, if you want to call it that. And
Sure.
it's interesting that I talk to faculty members and academics and whatnot, and they'll poo-poo all this stuff, to use that term. They'll dismiss all this publicly, but how many times have I run into someone late at night in a hall who then relates to me, Ph.D. academic, relates to me their own, we'll call it psychic experiences, but don't ever tell anyone about this. I know you're open to it, so I can talk to you, but don't you ever tell anyone that I said this, etc. Because,
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, we sort of mentioned it at the start there, but the Stanford Research Institute, and
yeah,
there's all sorts of CIA programs that have spent millions, if
exactly,
not billions, of dollars towards this thing. So there's clearly something there. I want
exactly.
I
So
want to
that's
relate it
the
to what you
digression.
were talking about. Sorry, there was a bit of a lag. I want to relate it to what you were talking about before, because I've heard you talk about this a little bit in connection to ancient history, and I find it fascinating, and I've wanted to hear more about this from you. You talk about there sort of being a psychic connection to ancient sites, and I know you've spoken about the subterranean chamber in the pyramid, and there's something strange that happens to people, and I'm curious what you've found in your explorations
Well,
between both of these things.
Well, I am convinced, based on my own work and my research and the research of other credible scientists. So, for instance, there was the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratories under Robert John for a long time at Princeton University. Unfortunately, he passed away, etc., and things got shut down. And they did a lot of studies, for instance, of ancient sites, sacred sites, for instance, in Egypt, using random event generators and how they would go non-random in certain contexts, which turned out to be sacred contexts, sacred sites. I'm in part a geophysicist, geologist and geophysicist. We know that there are different magnetic fields on the surface of the Earth. We know that magnetic fields, geomagnetic fields, can affect consciousness. Solar activity can affect consciousness. So there's a lot of things going on. And so if we just assume for a minute, and I think it's a good assumption based on the evidence, that certain types of psychic phenomena can be real, are real, there's a lot of evidence that they will correlate with geomagnetic fields. They will correlate with environmental factors that are going on. We don't understand this fully, but you can get stronger, say, telepathic style experiences in certain contexts and not in other contexts. Sacred sites, genuine sacred sites. You can't just put up a church or a cathedral or a temple any old place, I'm convinced, and make it a sacred site. There are actually locations on Earth that seem to have the right environmental aspects. And when I say environmental, I'm thinking primarily in geophysical aspects. And some of this may be because of solar outbursts. outburst. So there's evidence that the Giza Plateau from vitrification was literally hit by the sun during very intensely during a major solar outburst. I think at the last end of the last ice age, this will affect the situation there on the ground in terms of the geomagnetics and the magnetic properties, et cetera, et cetera. On the Giza Plateau, we actually see what are known as Lichtenberg patterns, dendritic patterns that you get when a major electrical strike occurs, a major plasma strike. This is something that Katie first discovered, my wife. I mean, she's really good. And I think this is an important point. Often it takes someone outside of a field to make observations because those who are ingrained in a certain field, a certain dogma, a certain paradigm, they do not see things outside of that paradigm, even if they may be obvious to an outsider. So I think that's actually given me an advantage as a geologist looking at some of these ancient sites because I'm not as invested in the paradigm of the Egyptologists or certain archaeologists and historians. So getting back to what we were just talking about, you asked me a question.
Yeah, I was asking you about the sort of connection between ancient history and sort of going to places such as
Yes,
the
yes, yes.
subterranean chamber and the
I
pyramid.
got it.
And
I got it.
mm,
So I think in many cases, what we find is that they were literally marking sites that were important that we can now demonstrate have properties to them. So we have areas, and other geophysicists have worked on this, where you have a sacred site, and you may have they may have in ancient times set up a temple or standing stones, etc. And we can determine that geophysically this was hit by major lightning strikes because the rocks still record that. The same with the Nazca Plain, where you have these huge geoglyphs. In fact, Katie and I speculate that some of those geoglyphs may be in the shape of plasma configurations, in some cases driven to the ground, maybe branding, if you would, and then later people consider it a sacred site. They walk along them, they reinforce them, they rebuild them, if you would, they mark them. Callanish in Scotland is a place where it's been determined that there's a sacred site and ancient stone structures on the site of a very ancient, we'll call it lightning strike, but probably solar outburst. So you have this. Getting back to the Great Pyramid, which you mentioned, in the subterranean chamber, and if people ever go to Egypt, or I take people to Egypt and will be for the solar eclipse in 2027. You and I were talking about that before we started recording.
nice little plug, yeah.
Yeah, it's a very exciting because it's the longest solar eclipse any of us will see in our lifetime, and it's viewable from very few areas on land. One of them happens to be Egypt, specifically Luxor, but we'll go to the Giza Plateau, we'll go to the pyramid, etc. Going in the pyramid, everyone's excited about the going up into the Grand Gallery, the King's Chamber, the Queen's Chamber. To me, the most significant area is the subterranean chamber, which many people have never bothered to go into, or they have off limits, but we always make sure we can get in there because there you're down in the bedrock. You're down deep under the Great Pyramid. I think that's the earliest, the oldest portion of the Great Pyramid because I think it was actually built in stages. And there you are experiencing something you can rarely experience in the modern world because we are bombarded all the time by electromagnetic radiation, cell towers and Wi-Fi and all this stuff. But you get down there, it filters that out. The rock filters it out. What do you experience? Just the natural, they sometimes call it the Earth's heartbeat, Schumann resonances, which are very low frequency, long wavelength electromagnetic radiation which occurs naturally, and we are adapted to it. We're developed, we evolve, whatever term you want to use, to interact with that. And I think it has a calming effect on the brain, if you would. It has a effect on consciousness. It allows people have experienced going into, we'll call it trances or different states down there. And I think the ancient people who first carved down there. They knew what they were doing. Are they marking potentially a plasma strike? There's evidence of that on the plateau. There's what's known as the, what's it called? The Orion shaft, I guess it is. And you can see when you go down into it, you can see evidence of vitrification and plasma deep down under the plateau from a solar outburst. I show people this when we go there. But yeah, so you get these very sacred spots that tie in with what we'll call psychic phenomena or paranormal phenomena. And I first got involved with this later in my life. I mean, I was exposed to it, as I just expressed, early on, but I didn't even know what to call it. It's just, oh, my aunt, you know, communicates. I didn't even know the word telepathy necessarily at that time, communicates with her identical sister in a way that just seemed natural, but, to a child, that, okay, that's what occurs. But getting back to my more recent work, more or less the last 40 years or so, being seriously interested in this as a scientist, as I think I said before, you see this alluded to or even expressed explicitly in ancient traditions, ancient cultures around the world. Again, are they all just imagining it? Is all just nonsense, the same nonsense in every ancient tradition? That's actually the standard explanation for it. And I remember learning that in college. Oh yeah, that's just the way the mind works, and we hallucinate the same way, or something like that. No, I don't think so. And I think that the modern science dovetailing with the ancient philosophies, the ancient traditions, shows there's something real there, and it can be manipulated. It also has to do with sound in some cases, and certain rhythms and frequencies of sound, which tie in with electromagnetic frequencies, because vibration can induce electromagnetic frequencies and vice versa. So it gets very complex, but to put it simply, we are part of nature. We are attuned to these things, and there's still a lot that either we don't know, or certainly is not accepted by conventional academics in many realms. Although I do want to say you have Nobel Prize winners who have studied psychic phenomena and taken it very seriously and found evidence for it. So
it's okay. In your research, in your study for the parapsychology revolution, you're saying that about 90% of what you come across is fake, con man, pretend, crystal ball, all this, etc. I remember there was what was it? It was a James Randi or something. Randi, you remember the Randi challenge?
He would challenge people, etc. That was such
Yeah.
to put it bluntly, because he would challenge people, and then when they came up with good evidence, it wasn't good enough for him, and he would change the rules, etc., etc. I mean, talk about the ultimate con man.
Well, it was also that nobody I don't know if
someone, but you get this, and this is a problem.
Yeah.
Some people call them the paradigm police, or the like the skeptical inquirer, etc. It's I don't know that we want to go there, but there's a lot of problems on both sides, should we say?
Sure. I mean, I don't want to
be objective and look at real evidence. And to me, you have to follow the real evidence wherever it goes. And if you don't like the results, so be it. And you also have to question yourself on a continued basis.
So then, okay, so in your own research, what did you sort of, because obviously you don't want to, if someone is sort of experiencing something, you don't want to shoot them in the foot before they have the opportunity to show you what's going on. And they say that with remote viewing, don't they? In Project Stargate, there was a lot of times when they would just simply get things wrong. And they did get more things right. From what I understand, they used remote viewing for like drug trafficking boats, and whereas they had success rates of about 5% with standard, planes and satellites and just standard sort of intelligence, they had a success rate of, from what I understand, about 30 to 33%. for finding these drug boats and things. So there is quite literally a mappable sort of success rate that you can see with these. And sometimes people can perform them, sometimes they can't. There's the whole question of if you throw someone on a television screen in front of millions of viewers worldwide and suddenly tell them to be psychic, they're not necessarily going to do it. I think Randy did that with Uri Geller because he was bending spoons, right? And then he got on television and he suddenly couldn't do it anymore. So you could argue it kind of either way. So when you go about researching this, and you've got this sort of ancient sort of timeline that you're looking at for these people who may have been able to do things in the past as well. What exactly are you looking for, and how are you disproving versus proving things for your own belief?
Okay, so a lot of it you can't really prove or disprove it, I would say, based on just ancient testimony. I mean, that's just not going to work. We don't have the reliability, etc. And a lot of it is a statistical argument of whether some. Let's just talk about telepathy. Let's not talk about psychokinesis or,
Sure.
there's different terms that are used for it. Let's just talk about telepathic information getting through. And a lot of the best research to this day, in my assessment, was done by, what was it, the Society for Psychical Research in London, in England. And they were doing this in the late 19th, early 20th century, where it's the best research because you can't duplicate it now because we now have cell phones, we now have electronic communications, etc. So to give you a crude example, but a real example, and I'm just generalizing here, but they had many real examples, and they would do their homework and check everything out, etc. So you have a British soldier stationed in India, and he doesn't have, it's only correspondence back and forth, mail correspondence back and forth, which of course took time, etc., etc. And he writes back to his family saying, I know there's nothing to it, but I had this weirdest dream that last night at such and such a time, I saw Grandma at the foot of my bed waving goodbye to me. And, I know there's nothing to it, but I'm sure she's in good health as she was when I left, etc., etc. It's postmarked. The SPR, the Society for Psychical Research, would do all the research on it to confirm it really was case. It was postmarked, it was received, etc., etc. It really, it turns out, and they check, the grandmother, when you take the time factor into account, the change, because different different dates and times in
Sure.
India versus London, and they put it all together. In fact, she died at the same time he was reporting seeing her at the foot of her bed, that type of thing, which is a very common phenomenon, where you have a strong emotional response or strong emotions being projected to other people. So maybe the grandmother, as she was dying, was thinking about her grandchildren or this particular grandson she was close to, and he picked that up telepathically in the form of, seeing her at the foot of the bed, which you could say was a hallucination, but a telepathically induced hallucination. More or less information was coming through. And what you find in most of these cases, or the best documented cases, is that it's emotionals things that are coming through. Emotions are coming through. So even the little examples I gave with my twin sister, the twin sisters, my aunts, it was always strong emotions that were coming through, usually negative, unfortunately, but strong emotions coming through. And when you start looking at numerous cases like this, well before the advent of modern communications, cell phones, etc., and you statistically analyze them for, is this just all random, or is there something coming through? What are the probabilities? What was found and has been found consistently in parapsychology revolution, there's that includes a number of reprints. It's really a book of anthology with commentary around it, including analysis of these types of data, and is there something statistically significant to them? And when you read it all out, yes, there's something statistically significant to them. In fact, some of the complicated or very fine statistics that are used for drug studies now, where, you have this drug and instead of 25 people out of thousands getting a heart attack, it's only 5 people, and that's statistically significant and a breakthrough. A
Mm.
lot of, so,
Yeah, yeah,
you have something like that, but it's real. And
yeah. Mm.
yes, there's a real effect. It might not stop everyone from having heart attacks or whatever. I'm just, using this as a hypothetical example, but a lot of those sophisticated statistics were actually developed and initiated by some of the members in the 19th century who are mathematicians trying to weed out psychic phenomena, if there's something really being occurring there, or is it just all coincidence? Because they certainly took that into account. Could this just be coincidence? So this guy just got it right about his grandmother, but we have, hundreds of other letters where people said the same thing and there was absolutely nothing to it. No, in fact, they did not have hundreds of other letters, but they would take that into account. How many times was it wrong versus right, and other instances, etc. Uh,
Mm.
and even if it's like you were saying, 30% of the time, I don't know those particular ones you were talking about, the drug dealers and that type of thing.
That was I was speaking with Paul H. Smith, who is a
Yeah,
remote viewing trainer. He was a remote viewer, and he also trained remote viewers and worked
yeah,
in Project Stargate. And there was some things he could mention, but that was and couldn't mention, but that was one of the main things he
yeah.
sort of told me was their
But
success
there you
rates.
have strong emotions involved, I think. And,
Mm,
people concerned. I mean, I don't know. I've
mm,
never been a drug dealer, but I assume if you're doing that type of thing, you're worried about being caught, etc.
mm,
You're
mm.
throwing off strong
Yeah.
emotional effects. It's the same with, I won't get into poltergeist. That's a whole nother thing. But that's
You,
saying,
you you always say I've heard you say this. You always say poltergeists, but you say you won't mention poltergeists. I
oh,
really want you to mention because
well,
actually
well,
I've had an experience. Well, I have a secondhand experience of a poltergeist from when I was a kid, and so
okay.
I'm fascinated by them. It's a long story. Basically, someone I knew had an encounter, and I stayed in the house where the poltergeist supposedly was, and I felt something was off, and then she told me after the fact. I didn't know that there was anything weird about the house, and then she'd mentioned it to me. So I've been fascinated by them, and I always hear you say I won't get into poltergeists, but I very much like you to get into poltergeists, even
Okay,
briefly.
just a little bit about poltergeist, and I've actually
Yeah.
experienced a poltergeist. I hate to admit that, but
Mm, mm,
generally, what a poltergeist is, it's not a ghost. It's not that's from the German. It's not a ghost. It's a person that's very emotionally upset, throwing off, should we say, psychic phenomena,
mm,
um, somewhat randomly, but generally directed at a person or something specific. And when I experienced it was I don't know, it directed at me. So I experienced it. And I literally had things, jump off shelves and that type
mm,
of thing.
mm,
It was minor. It wasn't huge, but it has to do again with strong emotions emanating from someone, whether it's because they're upset or something bad has happened to them, or they're in the process of doing a horrible crime and they're feeling that. Um, that's what it comes down to. And for instance, I shouldn't say this, but I will say this really quickly. Um, Remote viewing, and I have great respect for various remote viewers, etc., but there's no way in my assessment, and I've really looked at this quite a bit, um, to demonstrate that remote viewing is anything beyond telepathy.
mm,
What I mean by that is I'm a geologist, you can remote view a rock in the middle of the desert that ostensibly no one has ever looked at, but there's no way to confirm that remote viewing unless someone goes and looks at it.
yeah.
And this sounds crazy, but from a physics point of view, and real, genuine PhD physicists have looked into this type of thing, there is a fuzzy boundary between the past, the present, and the future. There's evidence, very good evidence, that the future can affect the present and the past if the past hasn't been reified, I'll use that term already. So when you remote view that rock in the desert, I don't know how you can determine that it was actually remote viewed versus picking up something telepathically from the future of what the person saw when they look at that rock.
Mm.
Am I making sense?
Yeah. Well, that was a big thing
And,
that
and there's more evidence for it because there have been cases where they go and they look at the building or the rock or whatever to check out the remote
yeah.
viewer. They make mistakes and they observe it incorrectly and they think they observe it. And that's what the remote viewer picked up, the mistakes, not the actual objective.
Mm.
You
Mm.
know, to make it very
Yeah.
simple, they look at it and they think, oh, well, that's sort of a reddish color. Um, but it's just the light at the time, and it's actually more beige or something. I don't know. I'm just making it
Mm,
up.
mm.
But
Or they pick up, the wrong target, or they'll pick up something nearby that was accurate, but they didn't realize that they weren't picking up what the trainer wanted them to
yeah,
pick up. That's
yeah,
definitely,
yeah.
happened quite a few
So
times.
there's a fuzzy issue between telepathy and uh, you know non-telepathic remote viewing, if I could put it that way. And again, I'm not putting down remote viewing at all, but I think these are, if you're going to look at it from an objective scientific point of view and take these things seriously, you have to take those types of things into account. And there's also the issue, and this has been noted by many parapsychologists, very well-qualified parapsychologists, is that skeptics can spoil the situation.
Hmm.
Uh, when you try to do controlled experiments and when you try to force one to be, quote, psychic, when they're not, it's not something you can necessarily force on the spot in front of a stage or in front of an audience, that type of thing. And then they revert to shenanigans, to faking it, etc. And then there are very good people who are very good at, stage magic, where it's all fraud, it's all fake. Maybe I'm more sensitive about these things because I'm a geologist. I'm not a lab scientist. Certainly done plenty of lab work, but as a geologist, use a classic example. I'm not a volcanologist. I don't study volcanoes, but that's certainly part of geology. So it's a simple example. People who study volcanoes, they can't just go and say, okay, erupt now so I can study you.
Mm, mm,
You
mm,
know what I mean? You have to wait till it happens naturally, or you have to look at the evidence from past eruptions. A lot of volcanologists, they'll go their entire career without necessarily ever having seen a live eruption
mhm,
because it's not something you can control. A lot of these paranormal phenomena, you can't just snap your fingers and control them and make them occur when they're going to occur. The same with solar outbursts. People may criticize me for that, and but I can't just demonstrate it by telling the sun, "Oh, have a solar outburst now," so I
mm,
can demonstrate the
mm.
effect. Um,
Yeah.
that's just not the way certain aspects of science work. Too many people have, I think, the concept of science as being, a chemistry lab or a physics lab where you can have controlled experiments. Interestingly, volcanoes, volcanic activity, earthquake activity,
Mm,
and this was anathema for a long time. Um, and it was crazy to mention this, but now in serious scientific publications like Nature, etc., the journal Nature, there are correlations between solar activity, earthquake activity, volcanic activity. And what seems to be the case is that the sun, because of changes in electromagnetic background, if we want to use that, can trigger earthquake activity, volcanic activity. So it may be that as an earthquake, you're building up incredible stresses that's
mm,
just waiting to be released, and solar activity can be the triggering effect. I'm being very simplistic, but think about people are familiar with avalanches, snow avalanches, where it's just waiting to happen and someone skis or claps their hands or whatever, and it sets the whole thing off. Or avalanches, landslides. You can have the same thing where it's just building up, waiting to happen, and a very small rainfall or just a very small other triggering factor can set off a huge landslide. So there's a lot of correlations that may not seem intuitively obvious, but they're real.
I think just generally the point seems to be, and this seems to be something people coming round to more, is that we're much more interconnected than we actually think we are. And there's sort of like this idea that we might be affected by. I think someone has asked the question. Everyone has asked this question at some point in their lives: is are we affected by the moon? Because you learn about how the tides work, and you go, well,
Oh,
surely
yeah.
it moves the water in our bodies. And from what you Google, because everyone Googles it, and it says no, there's absolutely no effect. But there must be some minor effect in some way or other. And it makes sense that with everything that's going on in the earth, and now we're learning about, I don't want to get too political, but we're learning about what happens in our bodies when we put too much, for example, glyphosate in our bodies, and the bodies completely change, and that can affect your brain. And it's just the subtlest of things that we
Oh,
were never told
but
would affect us in any way or another do, in fact, kind of entirely change our brain and body chemistry.
yes, absolutely, absolutely. Now, I'm not a specialist on the moon and how that's affecting us, but I have no doubt it's affecting us. And this is something actually I learned back as an undergraduate in geology classes, where you could look at lunar cycles in fossils, you know, corals and how they would grow, and you could actually map lunar cycles 400 plus million years ago, which I thought was fascinating as an undergraduate, and that it has a real effect. And you could look at seasonality, etc. Um, and what, unless you're a geologist and start learning about these things, you'd never expect it to be the case. And yes, we have, of course, the tides of water, but the Earth itself has tides in it. The Earth is not, it's not the rigid mass that most people think of it. I have no doubt that that's affecting human psychic uh, phenomena, that type of thing. And it's funny that you mentioned glyphosate. Katie, my wife, and I are really concerned about such things
Sure.
affecting the ecosystem, etc. We happen to be organic in the sense that we eat only 100% organic food, uh, which really limits our ability in America because the food situation in America is so
Yeah,
awful.
you'll never have bread ever again.
Oh, oh, a lot of it is not so much it's because the glyphosate is on all the wheat, etc. It's used as a desiccant. It's used with GMOs, etc., genetically modified organisms. It's a Roundup, Monsanto. I think you know about all this. This is digressing a bit,
No, no.
except that, uh, you know, going back to ancient people, they weren't dealing with this. They were not dealing with this type of thing. So they were essentially, and there's a lot of evidence for this, and I'm not into paleo diets and all that, because that's another fad, and I just won't comment on that. But we are doing, and I have been a co-author on environmental science textbooks, so this is something I also have a great interest in. And we, with our modern genetically modified organisms that have escaped into nature in some cases, with our use of pesticides and herbicides worldwide, which can now be detected around the world with our explosions, radiation, nuclear weapons, which can be picked up around the world, we are changing our environment. And I speak now as a geologist. Something that's being proposed and is in the works right now is to recognize a new time geologically. So we have, Pleistocene, we have the Ordovician, etc. You have periods of time, just like in historians have the medieval period, the Renaissance, etc. And something that's being proposed in a formal sense is the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene, the time of humans, basically, recent time of humans, and that this will be marked by a level of radiation that will be seen in the geological record millions, even hundreds of millions of years from now. You'll be able to see where humans started compromising, changing irrevocably the environment. That will be marked by layers of radiation, layers of microplastics, layers that will probably still have residual herbicides and pesticides like glyphosate in them. Uh, it's we are primary geological force, if you would, our influence on the earth now, humans. And I'm not convinced it's for the best at all. It's changing things irrevocably, and I don't think we can. I don't know how we can get out of it. I don't know how we can go back to earlier time, and it's affecting negatively so many things. I mean,
Mm.
this is just, I think, basic facts.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it's changing anytime soon. I do wonder.
But
There's
right
yeah,
now, I'm
sorry,
doing,
go ahead.
no, I was going to say right now, and I would encourage people to do it. What's the harm of being organic? More or less eating organic, trying to do the best you can in your own life. Um,
Yeah. I mean, if we could all have our own tiny farm and grow our own fruit and veg and have a cow, I would love that existence. It's not going to happen in London anytime soon, I don't think.
oh,
I don't.
no, same in Boston.
Great.
But
Yeah, I think that's a good little happier place to end it. I want to thank you again for your time. This has been a lovely, very wide-ranging conversation. We
oh,
did know it
very
was going to
wide
get all over the
I thought
place.
we were going to focus more on the Sphinx and that type of thing. And I never got, I tend to do this. Maybe I am wide ranging. I was talking at one point, and if I could put a little plug in, if you don't
Please,
mind,
no, please.
that I have a book out, and this is the book I would recommend people read if they're interested in learning more. It's called Forgotten Civilization. And I mentioned previously that the first edition in 2012, where I started talking about solar outbursts and that type of thing, had the subtitle, The Role of Solar Outbursts in Our Past and Future. The second revised, expanded with lots more photographs, with a new chapter added to it. It has everything in the first edition plus a lot more. The second revised edition has a new subtitle, and I'm looking at new discoveries on the solar induced dark age. So that's the edition that people should buy. I've known, I don't want to sound egotistical, I've known people who buy the second edition, love it, then they want to make sure they have the first edition for their I
Got to
collect
catch
books.
them all.
I
Yeah.
collect, so I know how that is. But if people are more interested in more information, I recommend the second revised and expanded edition of Forgotten Civilization. If people were interested, they can go to my website, which is my name, Robert Schoch, schoch.com, and find more information. And if I could put a little plug in, I am taking a group. We actually have a 9-day and 14-day versions of a trip to Egypt in 2027. I've taken many people to Egypt over the years, as well as going there for my own research. But this will coincide with this full solar eclipse in early August of 2027. So I'm very excited about that. I have to admit, it's not going to be an inexpensive trip because all the prices are really high in Egypt because it's, everyone wants to be there. The Egyptians know what they have because there's not many places other than going to sea to be able to see the full solar eclipse, to see it from Egypt and Luxor. And the sun was so important for the ancient Egyptians. It's going to be fabulous, but there will be a lot of people there, and the Egyptians know what they have, should we say? So they've jacked up prices, but I think it'll be worth it. I'm not one of those people who exaggerates. I see people taking trips to Egypt or advertising this or that. Oh, once in a lifetime experience. No, not really. You do this every
Not for
year.
you.
Year,
Yeah.
don't you? How's that once in a lifetime? So I never say that unless it really is. This solar eclipse, you won't see a solar eclipse of this duration, full solar eclipse, within our lifetime. And even partial or shorter solar eclipses that may occur, they're not going to be seen from Luxor in Egypt. So
Great.
this,
Yeah, I hope to join you. It sounds brilliant. I've never been to Egypt. I desperately want to go, and I was like,
oh,
this is
this
the
is the way
perfect.
to go. This is the
Yeah,
way to go.
perfect.
Um, uh, And,
All right.
it will do everything. I'll take everyone to all the sites that I love to take them to. If you go on the extended trip, I hate to be plugging it now, but we'll include some sites in Middle Egypt that are rarely visited by tourists. We've got we've got a couple of add-ons if people are interested in that in Alexandria and going to Jordan afterwards, which is wonderful too. So yeah, it's going to be a great trip.
Great. Check it out. Amazing. Thank you again. Thank you so much. Katie, I hope you've got all your notes there in the background as well.
Yes, absolutely. Try to
Great.
send some pictures.
Great. Amazing. All right. Thank you both. This has been lovely. Cheers. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Well, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you.
Cheers.